So this session is going to start, the final session. This session we have Dorit Nabel and Hadar Lubin. Hadar Lubin will be speaking first, and her topic, or the title of her presentation is Trauma in Disguise, Anti-Semitism. Hadar is an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry here at Yale University within the School of Medicine, and she's the director of the Post-Traumatic Street Center here in New Haven, Connecticut. Sorry.
That's a Freudian slip.
The street, but we get stress too.
Post-Traumatic Stress Center. It's a center here in New Haven. She received an MD from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and she's certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, and is a licensed physician here in Connecticut. She developed the publications dealing with developed women's trauma program, and has written extensively on treatment in post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's really an honor that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I got the core group that are willing to stay the whole day and listen to us talk. So it's terrific, because I think it will be a good dialogue. We all heard tremendous perspectives on how to think about anti-Semitism, and I believe we all been humbled of the enormity of the subject and how you really can even start to think about how you can really combat it. What I would like to introduce today, granted the topic of the conference today, to take a psychological construct to have an understanding really in how anti-Semitism really plays out when it is targeting the individual or even the larger group. And I would like to borrow the trauma construct to offer that as a model to understand really how anti-Semitism affects the person, and therefore as we have that particular perspective to maybe start thinking about ways to attend to the consequences of anti-Semitism as it plays out within the individual and maybe even collectively, if you will. Maybe even to kind of acknowledge that it would be nice if we can eradicate trauma in the world. We know we can't, given all many perspectives that we heard. However, if you have a better understanding of how trauma plays out, you can start think of the small ways and in due time maybe larger ways to really affect how it is affecting our milieu, our society at large. So I'm just borrowing a construct, and I'd like to go over it with you. Why should we talk about trauma when we think about anti-Semitism? Well, like trauma, anti-Semitism causes physical and or emotional harm. It leads to a sense of helplessness. It usually causes some kind of muteness to the person who experiences it, therefore to the group who experience it. It evokes fear. That's the vehicle for which the interaction takes place. It involves a power of differential that makes it very clear who is in charge and who has the control. In the language of trauma, the perpetrator, of course, is the agent of control, and the victim, or target, if you will, is the helpless one. Its effects, anti-Semitism, reverberates throughout life, and I would say throughout history, as we saw and heard today. It overwhelms the person's capacity to respond. The response of freeze and shock is very common, and that may even explain in small ways why there aren't very effective responses to anti-Semitism, because by nature it really freezes the potential for response and creates a psychological state of shock. What are the common responses of the victim to the traumatic effect or of the recipient of anti-Semitic event? And I'll just read through and go over in more details. Avoidance is a very common one. Silence, shame, and humiliation. We heard a little bit about differences of how those affect a person. Self-blame and guilt, sense of inadequacy, and heightened anxiety. Commonly manifested in constellation of symptoms. Some, I know, early presenters spoke about post-traumatic stress disorder. Avoidance. Often is in a form of withdrawal from activities or places associated with the experience. We heard quite commonly growing up in Israel that Holocaust survivors said, I'll never go back to Germany. There can be something as clear as that, or avoidance that is very subtle, however has an enormous effect on the persons in terms of the capacity to mobilize both their personal aspirations, careers, and travel because of the effect of anti-Semitism. Avoidance of people or social settings associated with the experience. Therefore increased sense of isolation or insulation, which supports the notion that the group becomes very insulated and more easily targeted as a result, and it denies quite often the experience of distress, so there will be a minimization of the effect. The silence, not reporting to authority. I do a lot of workshops in confronting anti-Semitism with middle school age kids and their parents. And quite often you hear that the events occur, but there will be no report to the authority, the local authority and the larger authority, and not communicating the event to friends or family, and minimizing the effects of the experience. Oh, it was just words. It really didn't bother me. I know that you don't understand, they are ignorant. And hide the Jewish identity. Quite often people will say, you know, I will never go with the Star of David in certain places, I'll put it under my shirt, or you'll not even admit that you're Jewish in certain circles because of that. So the loss of pride of the association. Shame and humiliation, attributing the experience to oneself rather than to the one who delivers it, namely the perpetrator. Being singled out or put down. The experience of helplessness leads to shame on its own right. There is a sense that I was not in charge of what happened, I feel weak as a result of it. Feeling bad about being Jewish. So the eroding in the sense of pride of the origin or the ethnic origin. Some anti-Semitic experiences are humiliating. The actual event itself can be humiliating. Being self-shame and self-blame and guilt. Being self-critical of the way you responded. As I said before, quite often the initial response is of freeze, of shock, so it is not going to be well articulated and thought through. And it is being misattributed as a failure to respond well. There's an attempt to find control in an out-of-control situation. So it's not possible, and it leads to a sense of guilt, or even more so, I called for it. There is something that I did, not only that other blame the victims, in fact, the victim himself or herself will blame themselves. I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have shown my yarmulke, I shouldn't have didn't talk about my connection to Israel or whatever that be. Sense of inadequacy. The actual anti-Semitic experience make you feel inadequate. Dehumanization or objectifying experiences linked to a sense of inadequacy. That's the purpose of it. Not only, we heard earlier that actually objectifying a person facilitate the capacity of violence and hatred, it actually also makes the person feel inadequate and deserving of that kind of response. As humans, we expect to be in charge of our fate. It's called self-agency. So when an anti-Semitic event derailed that particular trajectory, there is a sense that you're not able to really take yourself in the direction that you thought that you can actually be in charge of. If I'll work very hard, I'll do something very well. That will be interfered if somebody will target you and put you down and interfere your capacity to do as well as you hoped. The heightened anxiety that I spoke before, fear on itself leads to anxiety. Avoidance heightens the sense of anxiety. In fact, it fuels anxiety. Anticipation of a repeated experience or the anticipatory of the next experience, such as anti-Semitic experience, leads to anxiety. And feeling out of control leads to anxiety. So all ways lead to Rome. and the person is left in a heightened sense of anxiety which interferes to assess and respond accurately at the situation or effectively. So what are the different ways that target an individual? It can be overt or covert, direct or indirect, isolated versus in social context, emotional versus physical. Then the overt one, we've seen a lot of them. A direct remark, you're a dirty Jew, wipe Israel off the map of the world, versus doing something more covertly, being excluded because of Jewish faith. The United Nations makes a lot of decisions that are in being cloaked as human rights, but there is an anti-Semitic charge underneath, for instance. It can be done directly, target you as a person or cartoon, saying this is how a Jew looks like, versus making comments about Jews in general. That's so Jewish, or incitements and educational material that is actually quite common today, even in an institutionalized way in art facilities where the kids are being educated to hate Jews. Isolated versus social context. Encounter with the perpetrator without a witness. It happens in the privacy of the encounter versus being targeted in a public place or through the media. We see a lot of it in the media where we all are subjected to it. Emotional versus physical. Humiliating or demeaning remarks about Jews very directly can cause emotional strain, false accusation, demonization. All of those can cause an emotional burden to the person who is being targeted. It clearly can be in a physical manifestation when the person can be attacked or properties, threats of violence. We've seen, of course, the culmination of violence in the Holocaust. So what is the roadmap to empowerment? So what are the ways that presumably, as there is an understanding that this construct of trauma is a useful way to understand how it affects the individual, what can be done to really counter those kind of effects? I'll just read through it. Talk, tell, report, educate others, advocate, and get support. Breaking the silence, you've heard a lot about it. It's simple, but it's very effective. At the moment that something is being articulated, something is being aired out, like in a forum like that, there is an acknowledgement that this is something that cannot be ignored. Also, it moves the locus of responsibility from the privacy of recollection to the responsibility of society to be burdened by what's happening. Alert the system and the authority. Any kind of a traumatic event, today I'm talking about anti-Semitism as an example of it, need to be the burden of society. We are members of society, and even though individual may be targeted, the burden lies within society, and therefore any reparation can only occur in social context. Confront rather than avoid. I mentioned before that the avoidance does fuel anxiety, and therefore when I say confront, that's not to mean you have to confront the perpetrator, but confront the effect of the event. Sometimes confronting the perpetrator is the choice, and the confrontation is not with the violence of violence, but in direct dialogue around what happens rather than avoid either thinking about it or behaving in a certain way as a result of it. And of course the media responses. I assure you too, there is quite a bit of an effort, pro-Israeli, counter dialogue in the media, in writing, to counter this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric that we hear. Educate others. Combat ignorance. A lot of anti-Semitism is initiated from ignorance. Having information is useful. Educate the perpetrator and the bystanders. Some speakers did mention the bystanders. The bystanders is a particularly important agent because it can move from a passive stand of being somebody who stands by somebody else is being harmed to an active ally to the person who's been targeted. Educating the perpetrator is another useful way to really diffuse it. Of course, in a fundamentalistic mindset, probably education is a little bit too late. However, there is an education of the media and education of those who are the majority or bystander. Some become collaborators, not that they perpetrate themselves, but they don't stop what is happening, so knowledge can help arrest that process. As I said, knowledge is helpful and a powerful tool. Learn a lot of things that is helpful for a person to counter the effect and locate the fault in the perpetrator. Because at the moment that the fault is located at the victim, it completely paralyzes the process of really trying to make any response and any reaction. Advocate, help others understand and deal with the problem. Publications, have conferences like that. Empower the person, himself, herself, get involved. And the regaining of sense of control and taking action or becoming an advocate is a position of power and control. Get support. Validating the experience is, again, something that seem to be simple in nature, but very hard to do. Quite often is being ignored. Quite often, in fact, the attribution of the event is targeting the victim again. So validation prevents the automatic negative attribution that will take place as a result of the anti-Semitic event. Distance yourself from the perpetrator if education fails. If possible, isolating the perpetrator. Sharing the burden, making it a social urgency rather than an individual failure. And the power of numbers. Respond to an ally. Right, so what are the perpetrator dynamics that we can see that continue to facilitate and fuel anti-Semitism? Not taking the perpetrator seriously. Quite often people say, oh, those are just words, he really doesn't know what he's saying, or they are just a group of teenagers, what they know. So there is a sense of minimizing really the effect and the potency of making of a perpetrator or the perpetrator. Reframing the behavior. As I mentioned, just empty words when the words are written everywhere. Minimize the threat. This is crazy. They have no power to make any change, any difference. That's minimizing the threat, making the person or the group unready to deal with it. Be nice to the perpetrator with the hope they will like me. And maybe that would be somewhat provocative, but that's something that I think is quite common, and particularly in a group of in liberal thinking, is that there is an identification with the poor Palestinians, and if we will only be nice to them, then they will understand that we are humans, that we actually are good Jews. We are not as bad as they're depicting us, and therefore you will affect the outcome of it. That does not work usually. Blaming the victim, of course, it's easier to blame the victim, and the reason why, because the perpetrator is holding the power and usually is frightening, and if you to choose in what side to be, you want to be the side of the power, not the side of the powerless. And that's human nature, and that happens passively or actively. And as I said, ignoring the writing on the wall. So it is very clear that there is a threat, but it's being ignored. Okay, so what are the challenges as we are to encounter or try to combat anti-Semitism? The common one is fear of retribution. That if we will take a stand, we will be targeted as well. Quite often you'll talk to bystanders and they will say, yeah, I knew it was wrong and I wish I could help, but I can be targeted as well. And that could be true for the group as well. A lack of support, again, isolating and insulating the victim cuts them also off from support. The microaggression, oh, we are overreacting to it, also just, jokes. I mean, it's just, everybody uses that, so Jewish, it's just a joke or jab or whatever you. And of course, microaggressions in words can accumulate and build up and become macroaggressions, and they take a form of action. The notion of cycle of violence. Quite often the perpetrator is being viewed as, and appropriately so, quite often the perpetrator is a victim as well. But what about the accountability? Yes, indeed, sometimes the perpetrators are victims historically as well, and that may even fuel their wish to be in power, but the notion of accountability should stand outside of the vicious cycle of perpetration and violence. And I would like to propose also the identification with the aggressor, with the perpetrator, is very common fuel for anti-Israeli rhetoric. Quite often even Israelis are being viewed as, they are, like a former presenters mentioned, is that they are as well, are like the Nazis, they are the one in power, they are the one who are the aggressors. And they often that will generate anti-Israeli rhetoric, as I said before. I do want to mention the Anti-Defamation League as I'm a member or a trainer in the Anti-Defamation League, just as a good access for resources, and also the program of confronting anti-Semitism have been very effective in the state of Connecticut, in particularly to really address that from very early age. And I'm going to stop here with your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll just take 2 minutes to set up for next. Okay, so now Narit Schnabel is going to speak about, the title of her presentation is called Mixed Emotional Needs. Computers make Mixed emotional needs of Israeli Jews as potential source of ambivalence in the response to the Iranian challenge. Narit is a postdoctoral fellow here at Yale University in social psychology, and she's also an undergraduate advisor in psychology at the Open University in Israel. She taught at the Open University in Tel Aviv. She did her PhD in social psychology from Tel Aviv University, as well as her master's in social psychology and her BA in psychology, all at Tel Aviv University. So it's an honor that you're here.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for organizing this conference, which was very interesting and important. And as Charles said, I will speak about the emotional needs of Israeli Jews, so I'm a little off topic. I won't talk about anti-Semitism. I'll begin by presenting the needs-based model, a theoretical model that I developed together with Aryeh Nadler from Tel Aviv University. And I will present experimental data that examine the emotional needs of Israeli Jews in 2 different contexts of intergroup relations, the relations with the Germans and the relations with the Arabs in Israel. And I will show, or the data will show, that Israeli Jews experience divergent psychological threats and consequently divergent emotional needs in these 2 contexts. And I'll discuss the implications of this dual psychological experience to the response of Israeli Jews to the conflict in general and to the conflict with Iran in particular. And I will finally suggest as an interesting direction for future research that some duality may exist in the stereotypical perception of Iranians as well, and it might also affect the response to Iran. First of all, I would like to begin by distinguishing between two general psychological, I'm not confused, sorry, between general approaches to conflict and conflict resolution in social psychology. The realist approach suggests that disputes between persons and between individuals are grounded in conflicts over material interests, such as money or land. So the idea in the realist approach is that conflicts are a competition over scarce resources. The psychological needs approach, in contrast, suggests that conflict threaten the adversary's basic psychological needs, such as the need for worthy identity or self-esteem, positive self-esteem, or justice or security. And as a result, they experience emotional states or motivations, such as the motivation to get revenge, that prolong and intensify the conflict. And theories that grew out of the psychological needs approach often criticize the realist approach for overlooking the importance of non-instrumental factors that contribute to the maintenance of conflict. However, having said that, it's important to mention that there is no realistic conflict between these two approaches, but rather they may be viewed as complementary. And therefore, when I present the needs-based model, even though my focus will be on psychological processes and mechanism, this is not to deny that other elements that are more, other processes that are more, or interests that are more instrumental or materialistic in their nature do not operate as well. They're just not the focus of the model or the conference. The main tenet of the needs-based model is that following the victimization episode, both victims and perpetrators experience a threat over certain unique dimensions of their identities, and these threats bring about different emotional needs. Other way to phrase it would be that transgression deprives both victims and perpetrators of certain unique psychological resources, and this deprivation brings about different motivational states. The model also suggests that victims feel inferior regarding their honor, their self-esteem, their perceived control, their autonomy, their power, and therefore they experience an enhanced need for empowerment. Now, empowerment can be manifested in many different ways. For example, one way through which victims can be empowered is by taking revenge of their perpetrators. Another way is by having the perpetrators acknowledge the injustice caused to the victim, because such an acknowledgement serves as an admission of owing a moral debt to the victim, and this in returns control to the hands of the victims and empowers the victims. Perpetrators, on the other hand, do not suffer from loss of autonomy or power or control, but they do suffer from moral inferiority, and they may also feel, although not always, guilt or remorse, and these emotions actually stem from their anxiety over social exclusion, because the social sanction upon those who deviate from the group's norms or violate the moral standards of the designated moral community to which they wish to belong is their social rejection. Think, for example, about the embargo over South Africa. This is an example of a social rejection, social exclusion. And therefore, perpetrators are said to experience an enhanced need for acceptance. And again, acceptance can be manifested in several ways. One way through which it can be, they can feel reaccepted is by having the victims express empathy and understanding of the circumstances that compel them to act in an unacceptable manner. And using the terms of Erwin Staub that you mentioned earlier, this rehumanized the perpetrators. The idea that empowerment and acceptance are two basic human needs or fundamental emotional motivations or dimensions of identity that can be manifested in many different ways is reflected in many theories. I'll just mention a few. Bennis and Shepard talk about dominance and relatedness as two basic motivations of group members. Resources theory, a theory that that categorizes different resources that are exchanged in social interaction, mention status and love. Other theories speak about respect and liking, and it is easy to see how these concepts correspond to empowerment and acceptance in the needs-based model. And there is also the work of there is also the model of stereotype content that Peter mentioned earlier, that suggests that most stereotypes can be captured by two dimensions, respecting or competence and warmth, that reflect feelings of respect or disrespect on one hand, and liking versus disliking on the other hand. And there is also work suggesting that these two dimensions are often negatively correlated. So some groups, like Jews, for example, are likely to be perceived as highly competent, but not very warm or low on the warmth dimension. So just to summarize the main argument of the needs-based model, the idea is that the threatened dimension of identity for victims is their sense of power, and therefore they experience an enhanced need for empowerment, and that the threatened dimension of identity for perpetrators is their moral image, and therefore they experience an enhanced need for acceptance. And the model also suggests that satisfying these emotional needs through a mutual interaction can improve intergroup relations, but this will not be the focus of my talk today. Instead, I will move on to discuss the findings of two experiments that we conducted within our work on the needs-based model, and they examined the emotional needs of Israeli Jews in two different contexts of intergroup relations, the relations with Germans and the relations with Arabs. And these experiments inform us on the basic emotional needs experienced by Israeli Jews, and may therefore throw light on the psychology of their or our response to other conflicts as well, including the conflict with Iran. The first study focused on the relations between Jews and Germans. We had Israeli Jews and Germans as participants, and each participant was exposed to two speeches allegedly held by an outgroup representative. So Jews were exposed to messages conveyed by German representatives, and Germans were exposed to messages, speeches held by a Jewish representative. And the main message conveyed in the speech was either the empowerment or the acceptance of participants in groups. And it's also important to mention that the messages were identically phrased for both groups. So the acceptance speech conveyed the message that we should accept the Germans or the Jews. It is not easy for them to live with the past. And the empowerment message conveyed the idea that we should cherish the contribution of the Jews or the German to humanity. It is their right to feel strong and proud in their country. Our dependent measures were a moral image and sense of power that were measured prior to the exposure to the speeches, and following the speeches we measured the perceived positivity of the messages. For example, we asked participants which message they preferred, and positive outgroup orientation. For example, we asked them, how does this message make you perceive the outgroup? And the results showed that in the context of the Second World War and the Holocaust, Germans suffered from a threat to their moral image. Their moral image was lower than that of Jews, and Jews suffered from a threat to their sense of power. And furthermore, Jews perceived the message of empowerment as more positive and had a more positive outgroup orientation following it, because this message satisfied their need for empowerment in this context. In contrast, Germans perceived the message of acceptance as more positive, and they had a more positive outgroup orientation following it, because the message of acceptance satisfied their need. The second study used exactly the same experimental paradigm, the same procedure, design, dependent measures, but this time in a different context, in the context of, in the general context of the relations between Arabs and Jews in Israel, and specifically in the context of the Kfar Qasim massacre. And in this massacre, 43 Arab civilians were killed by the Israeli border patrol, by the Israeli Jewish border patrol. And so Jews were in the social role of perpetrators and Arabs were in the social role of victims. And again, each participant was exposed to two types of messages. The message of acceptance conveyed the idea that we should accept our brothers, the Jews or the Arabs. It is not easy for them to deal with their emotions following the massacre. Whereas the message of empowerment conveyed the idea that we should acknowledge the right of Jews or of Arabs to live in respect and to feel strong and proud in their homeland. And the results show that in the context of the Kfar Qasim massacre, Jews suffered from a threat to their moral image. They had a lower moral image than Arabs, and Arabs suffered from a lower sense of power than Jews. Furthermore, in this context, Jews perceived the message of acceptance as more positive and had a more positive outlook orientation following it, and Arabs perceived the message of empowerment as more positive and had a more positive outlook orientation following it, because the message of acceptance in this context satisfied the emotional needs of Jews, and the message of empowerment satisfied the emotional needs of Arabs. So, taken together, these studies show that Israeli Jews experience different or conflicting, opposing emotional needs in different contexts. In the context of the relations with Jews, they suffer from a threat to their sense of power and experience an enhanced need for empowerment. And in the context of the relations with the Arabs, they suffer from a lower moral image, or from a threat to their moral image, and experience an enhanced need for acceptance. However, it can be claimed that this is not something unique about Israeli Jews. It is possible that members of many different groups experience different emotional needs in different contexts. For example, it is possible that members of some European countries experience a threat to their moral image when discussing the colonialist period and a threat to their sense of power when discussing the Second World War. And nevertheless, the two contexts that we used in our experiments, you can almost say that they define the Israeli Jewish identity. They are central to the Israeli Jewish identity, and therefore they are likely to be particularly emotionally charged among Israeli Jews compared to members of other groups. The context of the Holocaust, which threatened the very right and ability of Jews to exist, is considered a major group trauma, and the context of the Israeli-Jewish conflict, which was defined by Batal as an intractable conflict, is prolonged, is violent, and it affects almost every aspect in the lives of the involved parties. And both conflicts, as I said, almost define the Israeli-Jewish identity and are reflected in language, in images, in myths, in collective memory. So therefore, they are likely to be particularly pronounced. The experience of these opposing needs is likely to be particularly pronounced among Israeli Jews. And further magnifying the experience of this emotional duality is the fact that while the context that we used in our second experiment, the Kfar Qasim massacre, is clear-cut in terms of the identity of victims and perpetrators, it is very clear that in that context Arabs were the victims and Jews were the perpetrators. The general context of the Jewish-Arab relations is not so clear-cut. On the contrary, what Noor and others suggested, it is characterized by a competitive victimhood, where both Israelis and Palestinians or Arabs often claim to be the real victims of the conflict. And consequently, Israeli Jews experience divergent emotional needs even within the context of Jewish-Arab conflict. So even when relating to that context, they are likely to experience divergent and different emotional needs. And to illustrate this, I see. Oh, okay. Just stop. I'll explain. Sure.
She was moved to the hospital, more dead than alive, with no chance of saving her. She has gone through 5 operations. The leg at the moment, her left leg is paralyzed with 2 of the nerves. Her pelvis was broken. It's not been reset. Both legs were broken. Her teeth were knocked out. Can't walk, I can't dance. Can't go to my place like I used to. I'm very limited because I need everyone's help to do things. I can't go to the bathroom by myself. That's a bit stress.
Okay, I didn't you just started before I had a chance to say that this video will illustrate the emotional needs of victims. So particularly her last sentence, she says, I don't think it's fair. Rather than saying I feel very miserable because of this injury. And this, I think, reflects the emotional need for empowerment, because the need for justice or fairness, as I explained before, justice is one form of social empowerment. So this video illustrated the emotional needs of Jews when placed in the social role of victims. And in contrast, this video illustrates the emotional needs of Jews when placed in the social role of perpetrators. So here there's an interview with an Israeli soldier that works in checkpoint. I don't know how familiar you are with what the checkpoints are. The checkpoints are physical barriers that were built following the Second Intifada, and the Israelis view them as protecting those who wish to harm the country from entering it, and the Palestinians view them as violations of their basic human rights for transportation. So this soldier her job is to check the documents of the Palestinians that approach the checkpoint and decide whether or not they can pass. And she discussed the way in which she is viewed by the Palestinians. Hard to hear. Okay, I don't know if you managed to hear, but again, the last sentence that she said exemplified the emotional needs of perpetrators. She said that she wants to show that she's just a human being, she's a human being after all, and this reflects the emotional need for rehumanization, using Staub terms, or re-acceptance. So, in general, I suggested that Israeli Jews experience divergent emotional needs, and the question is, what are the consequences of this emotional pendulum, this psychological duality, to the response of Israeli Jews to the conflict with Iran? So first of all, the experience of this duality raises the political dilemma, or intensifies the political dilemma of which threat is more crucial. So on one hand, we have the threat that is illustrated here. You see, these are stamps, official stamps of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they show guns or weapons pointing at the map of Israel or at Jerusalem. And here the threat is very clear. The threat is to our sense of power, to our sense of autonomy, existence, control. So this is one type of threat. But at the same time, you can see here the other representation of the other type of threat. And this graffiti, one is from Europe, one is from Australia, equalize the Star of David to the swastika. So the threat to our moral images is very clear. That the idea is that Jews are Nazis. So as Israelis, we have to decide which threat is more crucial, which one should we address first. Should we first should we give higher priority to taking care of the problem with Iran and restoring our sense of power, or should we give higher priority to taking care of our moral image, the way we are perceived in the world, in order to avoid social rejection or social being under embargo or curfew or other forms of social rejection. And different group members, different Israelis are likely to come up with different answers to these questions. So for example, right-wing supporters might experience the first type of threat as more important or more crucial, and left-wing supporters are likely to experience the second type of threat as more crucial. And this makes it very hard to find and to express a cohesive group voice, to make a clear group voice because of this duality. The second consequence is what might be referred to as the damned if you do, damned if you don't trap in Israel's foreign relations. Each form of response to these threats is likely to satisfy one need at the expense of the other. So if we take care of the threat on our sense of power, we're likely to experience an intensified threat to our moral image. But on the other hand, if we decide not to restrain from attacking Iran and then to respond to the threat on our moral image, to avoid threatening our moral image, then we are likely to experience the threat to our sense of power more intensively. So there is an inherent trap regarding Israel's response. Another consequence is based on the theory of ambivalence amplification, and this theory suggests that when we encounter an ambivalent situation, a situation that evolves, that gives rise to different needs or psychological elements within us, our final response will be amplified because the energy from one psychological element will be drawn to the other element, and I think in Freudian terms it is called a reactive cathexis or reactive displacement of cathexis. Right? But the idea for social psychologists is that the response is amplified. So, for example, there are experiments showing that when we face a person that belongs to a stigmatized group, for example, a disabled person or a minority group member, we feel on one hand aversion and on the other hand sympathy. So we have an ambivalent response. And our final response, whether it's positive or negative, is particularly amplified compared to the same response, compared to an equivalent response to a member of non-stigmatized group. So that's the idea of this theory. And when applying it to the context of Israeli response to Iran or to intergroup conflicts in general, the opposing needs are likely to result in a pattern of two phases. First, we'll experience a phase of vacillation, of indecisiveness, and it will be followed by an amplified response. And it is possible that the response in the Oferet Yitzhak operation showed this pattern, because most of the criticism, I believe, on the Israeli actions in this operation was not upon the right to respond to the attacks of the Hamas, but rather on the magnitude of this response. So it is possible that it is influenced by this psychological mechanism. And finally, as a future direction for research, I would like to suggest to take the same dimensions that I just used to analyze the needs of Israeli Jews, the emotional needs or dimensions of identity of Israeli Jews. So we can use the same dimensions to examine the stereotypical perceptions of Iranians by Israelis. And as I mentioned before, the dimensions of power and morality, or empowerment and acceptance, highly correspond to the stereotype content model that Peter presented earlier. And this model suggests that when people meet others, they want to know what the other's goal will be vis-a-vis the self or in-group, and how effectively the other will pursue these goals. That is, perceivers want to know the other's intent, positive or negative, and capability. These characteristics correspond to perceptions of warmth and competence, respectively. And I also mentioned the work of Judd and colleagues that show that these dimensions are often negatively correlated. So, for example, the stereotypical perceptions of Germans will be as very competent, but not very warm, or not very moral. However, I would like to suggest that Iranians may be stereotypically perceived by Israeli Jews as low on both dimensions. So regarding the warmth dimensions, it's pretty straightforward. The negative intentions of Iran towards Israel were explicitly expressed. So this one is pretty clear. And based on the work of Edward Said and others, I would also like to suggest that they might be perceived as low on the competence dimension, because non-Western peoples and cultures in general, and Muslims in particular, are stereotypically perceived as inferior to the West. They're perceived as passive, as primitive, as culturally underdeveloped, culturally, technologically, economically underdeveloped. So in general, they might be perceived as low on the competence dimension, and this might lead to questioning their ability to pursue their negative goals, to doubting their ability to pursue their negative goals. So on one hand, yes, they have negative intentions, but on the other hand, because they might be low on the competence dimension, maybe we shouldn't take them too seriously. So this is another form of ambivalence or duality in the Israeli response to Iran. So to summarize my argument, I suggested that Israeli Jews who continually face threats to both their collective sense of power and their moral image have opposing emotional needs, resulting in experiencing a psychological duality. And there might be some duality in the stereotypical perceptions of Iran by Israeli Jews. And this results in an ambivalence that affects the response of Israeli Jews to the conflict with Iran.
Passive and not a serious threat, for sure. And I was wondering we can't do this in your study. You can't do this with the Jewish-German relations. But I was wondering, in terms of the Jewish-Arab relations, you can sort of switch around the scenario to measure differences. So you look at a massacre of Palestinians by Israelis. Why don't you look at a massacre of Israelis by Palestinians and measure the response? And is there an inherent flaw in your study if you can't measure the reactions of both groups to similar situations?
No, I believe that I didn't do it yet, but I believe that if I do the equivalent study, then I'll get the Arabs, when confronted with facts about them being as perpetrators, they will experience an enhanced need for acceptance, for understanding, for empathy. It's not something inherent about Jews. Yes, I would predict that if Palestinians read about terror attacks or other offenses conducted by Palestinians, in that context they will feel an enhanced need for acceptance and not for empowerment. This is one thing. The other thing regarding the Iranian, I'm not saying that that's the only thing that might paralyze Israelis because they think, oh, we shouldn't take them seriously. But this is one factor that operates there. For example, when I worked on the presentation in the paper, I saw that many times the atomic bomb is described as primitive. So they're saying, yes, they're getting an atomic bomb, a nuclear bomb, but it's primitive. It's like the bombs of the Russians in the 60s or something like that. So I think that this association or it might cause underestimation of their ability to pursue their goals. Maybe they're not taken seriously enough.
I would actually, from the perspective that I presented, I think this is a good example where there is a minimization of the threat coming in relationship to what is the perpetrator threat to the existence of the victims, just to minimize or to empty the threat to just words rather than to an actual existential threat. So that's the way I would feel it.
Okay, I have a question to Nurit and question to Hadar. So to Hadar, the question like we, clinical psychology or psychiatry usually treat the victim and like with a great empathy. And I don't know like if there's a way to treat the perpetrator. What strategies do we have in psychiatry or psychology? And like what models? Is it trauma models? Is it models for borderline, other things? So this is the question. If we have anything that we can apply to this context. And question to Nurit, we talked today, in my talk about goals, and I would like to play together, like to put your dimensions on needs, like to look at it as like some kind of activated goals. And we talk about goals, like goals are activated, and then once they are, when they are satisfied, they are reduced. So in your model, it looks as if like the two needs are some kind of static. And my question is, like, to what extent do you think that it's dynamic? Because we know that in social contexts are dynamic, and so not in terms like it could be the dynamics could be resulted by the response of the other side, or even by the person himself. Like once he if someone experienced the need for empowerment, and then he gets a feedback, so maybe this need is reduced, and then another needs is increased. So I mean, the question is like if you can see, or if you think that there is a connection between the models of goals and models of emotional needs. And so that's it.
Do you want me to answer first?
I don't know, like you decide if you have like anything to say on it.
Well, I think that I said before that it's in the context of what kind of perpetrator-victim dynamic are not useful in really paralyzing the effective response to say that most perpetrators are victims themselves, which I think it's true. However, in the context of your question, I'd like to answer it from the perspective that if you are treating a perpetrator who is also a victim, the treatment, the trauma model does help, because quite often the attempt to get to a position of power is stemming from the helplessness that inherent in the victim place, or alternatively, to have actually even more specifically trauma reenactment, where there is an identification with the perpetrator, where the victim chooses to take the position of power, become the perpetrator him or herself, and then be in a position that they can have some sense of control. So deciphering it from the context of understanding how the trauma affects the person would be useful in working with perpetrators. In my work, I work both with combat-related trauma in the VA setting with Vietnam veterans, that many of them were, it was actually a complex presentation where in their childhood suffered a lot of childhood abuse, been in the war and suffered work-related trauma, came back home and became victims of the homecoming, and then became perpetrators to their wives and children when they became perpetrators themselves. So the complexity of where they move from victim to perpetrator is enormous. So the so-called simplistic but yet kind of a very core perspective would be to go to the perspective of the trauma and how the victim can start empowering himself and therefore not need to take a violent mean of power or even mindless mean of power. I did not work exclusively with perpetrators, so not randomly, but I don't have a maybe specific experience just working with this population as a whole.
I think that it's related to the second consequence that I mentioned, that there is a dynamic of satisfying one need and then experiencing the other. And I'll give two examples, one personal and one maybe from Stephen Hopful's earlier presentation. So, for example, following the attacks by Hamas or by Hezbollah during the Second World War, I would feel, no, we have to respond to this, we can't shut up. And then, after we respond, I think, oh, but there is so much civilians that are being hurt, how could we do it? But it was not something that was not predictable, because that's what happens in war. And I feel that this is exactly the reason. The problem is that you satisfy one need and then you experience the other. And I think that Stephen's example earlier on about the Americans' response to 9/11 is similar. So first of all, everybody wanted to attack even before it was clear who is responsible for the terror attack. But later now you can see the response that part of it is related to why do we interfere with other countries, or considerations that are more related to the moral image. But again, this is not something you can predict before you act. It just reflects, I think, the different weights that is given to each need in different phases.
I have a question for you, which is that it seems to me that when you perpetrate an atrocity of some sort, you do it in a socio-political context. And that the existence of some needs that you find in a study done in Israel or in a Western democracy with Western values may be very different than the needs that you would find in the Muslim world or in some non-Western society which may not share the same values, etc. First of all, one person's perpetration of an atrocity may not seem like perpetrating to somebody else, and it may be that Israelis are very sensitive to the bad things that they're forced to do. It may be that Americans would be the same way, but it may not be. Now, you have rather small effect sizes in your studies based on stimulation of a priming that occurs before it. It seems to me that you really can't say much of anything at all about what's going on psychologically outside of the context in which you did the research. And I was wondering what you would say about it.
I have a couple of things to say. First of all, I didn't get into it because I didn't want it to be too much in detail, but our idea is, sometimes I use the term morality, but our idea is not about more sense of morality, inner sense of morality, but rather about moral image. Because I think that the threat to perpetrator is the threat of social rejection. So it's not so much whether they feel that it is right or wrong, but rather whether they feel that what they did is perceived by others as right or wrong. So this is one distinction that I see.
By others in their culture or by others?
Okay, that relates to a different question. Who is so my answer usually is significant others, but then the question is what significant others might mean, and that's another question. And also you mentioned the effect size are very small, and it's true. I think that beyond the situational placement of being in one social role or another, there are, because I did everything in the Western culture, I related to it as a personality variables, that maybe some people in general have a general tendency to experience the need for empowerment as stronger, and others may feel the need for acceptance as stronger. But of course, in the same sense, there might be cultural differences, and I didn't check them. It's true.
I mean, an example of that might be, say, honor killings. If you were to look at killings of daughters or sisters who have been felt to disgrace the family. I mean, there the social context would be everything, even in terms of whether you experienced yourself as the perpetrator or the victim. In Arab cultures where a woman may get killed for dishonoring the family in some way, even construing that, even each party's construction of who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. I mean, yes, it's clear that one person is killing somebody else, but who has been the victim of the atrocity and what the issues of empowerment or acceptance are would be a totally different context than you would understand it in a Western context.
Yeah, although specifically in this context it's a little complicated because one of the arguments is that the family doesn't really see the daughter as the perpetrator, but if they kill the person that violated her.
But or we even say revenge, avenging.
If they take revenge of the guy, then it will start a whole cycle of counter-revenge, and so the easiest thing would be just to kill the woman. So that's
but
the
they do blame her as having somehow caused it off. I think there is
right.
But or you could put it you could put it in the context of what I was talking about, that if a lot of these scapegoat ideologies lead to violence, it's we have been the Nazi self-image of Mein Kampf, it's we've been too benevolent, the Germans have been too benevolent, the Jews have stabbed us in the back, they took advantage of us, we're the victims. And I think that a lot of these perpetration acts come out of feeling that you're the victim, and now looking back on it, maybe some people change their perspective, right? But in the thick of it, if you feel that you've been victimized and you're doing what you have to do as self-defense, and you believe in that justification, then maybe that's different.
Sure,
right?
sure. That's related to
Right. Yeah, it
to
is.
my
It
previous
is.
answer.
Yeah.
That maybe if the Nazis has won, then we would get different results, or wouldn't be able to conduct this study. But the idea is that's why I'm saying I don't think that the Nazis or the Germans felt that they are doing something immorally. But right now, at the time of yes, they realize that their moral image, that there is a threat over their moral image. So whether or not they think they feel guilt. That's why at the beginning I also said remorse and guilt are feelings that we don't get so much, and it's more the impairment to the moral image that raises the fear of social rejection.
Right, and then that's at that point that you said whether who's the other that you care about, because there may be others that you don't care about what they think.
Exactly.
And whether guilt needs to be involved here, the question.
I think it's not. We began with this, but we saw that we just don't get guilt, so that's why we realized that the important thing is moral image, and I agree that because the threat is to a sense of belongingness or acceptance, then it's also important who comprises the relevant designated moral community. That's the term by Tabucci, sociologists. So of course you can get different responses to that, and they will affect you.
More questions to Adar or to Louis. One question is what tools do we have? It's like a follow-up question. What tools do we have to treat people that they don't want to get therapy? I mean, like when someone comes to the clinic and say, okay, I'm suffering, I'm traumatized, so it's easy. But what if we put you in Iran? What would you do there? I mean, it's a hypothetical question. How can we use tools of psychology to, if at all, to intervene in population where they don't think that something is wrong? And the other question is I think this panel was really interesting because it's combines social psychology and clinical psychology, and then the question is it looks that the world is getting crazy, and so the question is where is the boundary between stereotype and psychopathology? I mean, because on the one hand we can say okay, it's a prejudice. On the other hand, when it comes to genocidal threat, it's insane. And so what answers psychology have to make the distinction, if at all, between the two? I'm sorry, but you're smart.
It's just a small question. I think that clearly if somebody comes and seek treatment, you already have an entry, but that does not guarantee that you're going to be able to deliver what is it that they are seeking. I think that what can be particularly useful, and that may be also transformed to for a different purpose rather than just a clinical intervention, maybe social intervention, is to have a true understanding as to what are the human responses to it. We may be living in different contexts, but there is some sense of humanity that does bind us all to our species. I mean, we're not just defined by our cultures and set of beliefs and set of goals and so forth. There is a human perspective that needs to be capitalized on, in my perspective, and that actually the kind of model that we use in our trauma center is to try to depathologize the response to trauma or to any kind of aggression, because it is the human condition that really is a characteristic of the response and therefore of the intervention. So in the clinical setting, you can put it in a paradigm of treatment intervention. In a social setting, you can put it in a paradigm of interpersonal connections and how the responsibility to one another is also. So I think that just understanding how this power differential affects people and the response probably is somewhat universal. We express it in different ways, but it's very universal. I think people do understand what it is to be oppressed, no matter what the context is. It does call for a certain kind of response. And I think if you can bring it out, that is the beginning, because any healing, in the therapy session or in social setting, needs to be in the context of society. It cannot be in isolation. So in fact, you don't need to have the pathology perspective.
Right.
I mean, I'm not completely, just as a perspective.
I guess I have a less clinical question relating to, as a comment and a question in regard to what Israelis are thinking about Iran. I guess the comment, I just want to broaden the Israelis' look at Iran. We talked earlier really more about the possibility of the nuclear threat, but actually the threat of Iran supplying weapons, which could even be nuclear, and to Israel's neighbors are really part of the equation as well. I guess the question I had with that as a background, how do you feel about this last election from the point of view of knowing what is the psychology of Israelis? It was interesting, the rightist parties, not most of the votes, but the two major parties were very close, only one vote between them. So is that suggesting kind of the split of attitudes in regard to Iran?
I don't know if Iran was the major, I don't know. But what I feel as a duality or something that is changing in Israeli politics is that on one hand the population becomes more and more supporting right-wing and the way they identify themselves. But on the other hand, if you look at the ideologies of some of this right, as Stephen Hopeful said earlier, there are around 78% people's, right, is that what it says? 78 percentage of the people support the two-state solution. So there is a gap between the practical solutions that people adopt that are more what if it was 50 years ago what was considered left-wing, and their self-identification as right-wing. I don't know if that answers.
That's just a shortcoming of polling, because the majority voted for Hamas in the elections that they had. That led to the whole crisis in the last couple of years.
Right, but on the other hand, it might be that I don't know how involved you are, but the recent elections in Israel were more about social justice. It was not so much about the conflict with the Arabs. So in a similar way, I think that the election of Hamas was highly related to internal issues within the Palestinian, because the Palestinian Authority was very corrupted. And I think part of the support of the Hamas is related to internal Palestinian issues, so it's not just about that.
But don't you think that they read the Hamas charter that we had elaborated for us?
Yes, they probably. I'm not trying to justify, but I'm just saying that part of it is internal issues. It was not just about. It was a lot of it was about the rejection of the corruption in the Palestinian Authority because they got a lot of money and didn't get the people themselves. So there was a lot of frustration about it. And also, I don't know, Paul's. It also depends on how much we believe in false.
I'll give you 2 cents to Bert's question. I think the fact that Netanyahu reached out to Barak, even though the Labour Party suffered losses in the election, sends a very clear signal to Tehran that this is the type of government that needs to be in place to deal with the Iranian threat. So he didn't reach out to other parties that were probably more appropriate for an effective coalition. So anybody else for a question?
I actually didn't have a question about this panel, but as we're closing up and I'm sort of going back to the beginning theme.
Okay, so you know what, so I'm going to stop there, and I think we're going to start have a roundtable discussion.
Oh.
I thought maybe we'll just take a 5-minute break, there's still drinks in the back, and if there's no other questions, and then we can have a roundtable discussion starting in 5 minutes. So somebody, anything else? Okay. Thank you, Larry. Thank you. Delve into issues of anti-Semitism with a focus on psychology, social psychology, psychiatry. I think it was helpful. I remember I used to have a supervisor who used to tell me that I wasn't focused enough on my research and I'd make little marks all over the world, and the idea was to drill a hole deep in the oil and then the oil would come up over the earth. So I think in a way we focused on a very specific discipline of anti-Semitism. I think it was fruitful. So thank you.
Saying there's oil in Israel now?
Apparently there is. I just read that they have enough natural gas now to be self-sufficient. But so anybody like to comment on the day and some of the issues that were raised and ideas for research, thoughts, concerns?
This is more emotive than rational, so forgive me. But you know, thinking through the whole day, and again being at Columbia and struggling with this idea of the Columbia faculty, some of which are, you know, I think pro-Israel but silent. Some of the faculty are very anti-Israel, both Jews and non-Jews, and things like that. And it occurs to me that in terms of some of the silence, the feeling I had through a bunch of the speeches were that where we are as Jews in terms of this movement of civil rights and increasing tolerance is that we're like where gays were in the 1950s. You know, it's kind of like half of us, some of us are out of the closet, and the other half feel like, no, it's really bad to be a Jew. You know, there's a sense of that. And I was trying to find an analogy of where we are in terms of civil rights movement, and that's the one. I don't know how anyone can relate to this, or it just sounds crazy,
really
but that's
nice
where it was.
Thing to throw out there after they took you through that. Yeah.
In terms of the struggle of, you know what I mean, in terms of struggle of, and I like this thing about, you know, report incidents that the ADL was doing with Hadar, you know, report these incidents, you know, stand up for these things and do that. But it did sound like something like, do we have to learn this now? It's so funny that we have to learn this now, you know, and yet we seem to have to relearn those principles, you know, of coming out of this closet. And and it also reminded me, another emotive thing is that I have never done it, but for about a year now, I've had this fantasy of showing up to work wearing a yellow star which says Zionist on it. So it's sort of the atmosphere. I guess it's just that atmosphere that I grew up in Columbia, and it's an institution that I really loved, and now it's a place in which I actually feel like I'm the outsider, I'm the closeted one. And it's a very unusual thing.
This reminds me of, do you know the book, maybe you're interested in it, by John Stratton, Coming Out Jewish? He writes as an Australian academic. He wrote that, I think, in '98. He writes about all those issues, being in academia and surrounded by liberals. And so.
Title again?
Coming Out Jewish,
Thank you.
John Stratton.
Thank you.
It goes with your
Vic Seidler wrote
metaphor.
something similar at Goldsmiths. Vic Seidler he became a professor at Goldsmiths College in social theory. His speech, his inaugural lecture, which was it's a very prominent thing at Goldsmiths College, was he came out as a Jew in his lecture. It was very moving and very troubling at the same time.
What's this show?
Victor Seidler is a serious social theorist.
I think for me, one of the solutions would be to have more data on it. I always feel better to speak about things when I have data. So, for example, I often feel that violations of human rights by Israel receive much more attention by the media and much more much more responses like demonstration than violations of human rights in other places. But if I had data showing that, just quantitative data, I would feel, because it's something, for example, I wanted to write in the chapter, but because I wanted to say, we experience the emotional needs as, we have a particularly emotionally charged response to these needs, but also the world responds in a way that is very emotionally charged to everything we do, like the mirror of it, but I didn't have any data on it. So I don't know, maybe there is and I'm just not aware of it. But for me, one of the things to expose, of the ways to expose these biases is by just having research on it.
So Charles, could you guys serve sort of as a resource of that, so people could sort of send in questions, say, here's what I need, you know what I mean? People could sort of send in things to you, because you have access to so many scholars. Here's what I need to understand in order to make this argument. I need this, you know, kind of a virtual discourse.
Yeah, there's two things. I think there's a need for maybe a research, it would be very good. People are beginning to look at anti-Semitism on campus, but also maybe anti-Semitism among the academy, among scholars. And this feeling that you articulated, I'm sure you're not in isolation, but it would be interesting for maybe a social psychologist to do actually a proper, high-caliber, you know, study on the American academic scene in terms of these issues. And that we don't have the resources to support it, but we can support it intellectually. But the idea of YIISA will be to become a documentation center and a resource that parliamentarians and scholars can access. This is the next project we're working on. So will be, I hope, within 18 months we'll have this project up and running.
Basically, my experience of the day was totally different. Out of all the talks, it was very interesting. But I mean, like, to see that it's not only a problem of Jews. I mean, like we briefly talked about like why we no longer talk about anti-Semitism now, but like after the Holocaust it was very popular, and now maybe it's like we talk about it again. But I mean, like, so this was only brief talk, but then I mean, your talk about relational prejudice, and your talk that we talked about, like it's more a human problem, and when I talk about the Hamas, so I don't think that it's only a problem of Jews. We see the same dynamics in different contexts, and we now need to apply it in a specific context, but I don't feel some kind of responsibility to say like, we are Jews, how difficult it is to be a Jew, because now I have all this responsibility. I think it's like something that it's an international problem, and we can learn from the experience in the Holocaust, Rwanda, and I think also as a strategy, it's a better way to to be united with other ways, with other problems, with other forms of prejudice, because in that way we gain more power, as opposed to say, well, we are Jews, we are victims, how difficult it is to be Jew, and so on. And I agree that we need to have data.
But Jews have been at the forefront of the civil rights movement for the last 30 years. I mean, that's where, you know what I mean, that's where I feel the sense of betrayal, right? I mean, Jews have been at the forefront of the civil rights movement. I myself, you know, was at civil rights demonstrations. I marched against the Klan in New Jersey, for God's sakes. You know, the Klan is in New Jersey. In the late 1960s, I was on the marches that were dangerous to my health, and I marched on them. So
It's actually been the last 100 years, but that only adds to your point.
I still have the feeling that there is a lack of information in the general public about just what is going on in the Muslim and Arab world about Jews. And I feel that that when scholars get together, they get drawn towards issues that strike me as fairly obscure from the point of view of the political problem that we're facing, and that the solutions that psychologists are likely to come up with, they all are, well, maybe after we get more data and the theory gets developed, and 100 years later, maybe we'll have an intervention that might be likely to work. Whereas I feel the proper role right now for scholars, maybe not for psychologists, but for scholars of anti-Semitism, is to document just what's going on in the Middle East with regard to Jews, and to get the message out there. And the way I see social psychology, or the contribution of psychology and social psychology, is in how to get the message out there. In other words, how not to find out about, and I'm not denigrating any of the theoretical work on anti-Semitism. I think there is merit to it. I read it, I've been consuming it, producing small amounts of it for years, but I think that the political problem can't wait for the research problem. And that particularly if we look at the reward structures of the various disciplines, they don't reward the type of research that I'm talking about. They reward the type of research which ends up building theoretical models, and this is not just in social psychology or in psychology, but they don't, in history they reward focusing on a very, very small part of the problem from years ago. In the humanities, in English, I'm not exactly sure what it is they're doing, but I think that's my ignorance. But in any case, they never quite get back to the real problem at hand. And I come away from these conferences often with the feeling that if you can't convince the anti-Semitism researchers that there's a problem and a task, then the problem is bigger than I thought. I mean, I guess that's sort of an outside perspective here, but that's my feeling. So,
I just want to say, the scholar of the humanities, that they do actually work and try to figure out why things happen, just not from statistics, but from other tools.
I'm willing to believe it. I just think it takes an awful lot of investment to catch up with it.
Picking up on that point, how do you perceive the role of researchers and YIISA, other groups of this type, relating to interacting with political leadership so that changes do occur, rather than doing research without moving it up into action?
So, I think Henri Bernard Levy said it very well when he said that the role of an intellectual or a scholar is to shine light where there's darkness. And I hope, given the social and economic and political and cultural reality that we're living in the moment, and the crisis and the emergency when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism and genocidal antisemitism in particular, vis-a-vis the social movement of radical Islam, not to be confused with Islam. I think it has to be a very powerful distinction, because actually I think Muslims are the biggest victims of this extraordinarily reactionary genocidal social movement. And the role I think we're playing is, I think, in a way to ring alarm bells, to tell the academy to wake up and to do serious high caliber research into this phenomenon, and to also meet with policymakers and to present high caliber research to policymakers, to leaders of NGOs, and to have an impact. And I think this is the responsibility and the moral obligation of scholars. And ethically speaking, if you have the time and resources to sit back and to read and to think, and you know of a problem, and you're in the ivory tower, it's worse than being ignorant. It's morally reprehensible. And I think that we as scholars have to engage students, faculty, and the public. Not as ideologues and not as politicians, but as high caliber scholars.
I think that we also cannot just focus on students and educating students. Prejudice starts at age 2, by 3, even 4, it's set in a lot of ways. And so you have to try to educate parents, or parents to be, in terms of awareness. And whether it's just Jewish parents as a focus, it has to be much earlier than junior high school. Although it's very effective, but you go home and the prejudices are there at home.
Yeah, it's been a challenge for the Anti-Defamation League, because we do now a lot of anti-bullying workshops, and the bullying started pre-K. So we usually target the high schoolers. At that point, it's completely consolidated, and the hands down and so forth. So it's a challenge how to translate those kind of programs that usually are quite charged very early on. That's true, of course, for any kind of version of prejudice.
But you can also show anti-Semitism as the ultimate bullying and what it can lead to. You know, you start out by pushing somebody and then you punch somebody and then you call them all kinds of names. And that's just the basic essence. That's where it starts. And so it'd be nice to have some kind of a connection, even if it's an indirect connection.
Nadia wants to say something just very quickly. I think YIISA is really, to the scholars who are here, our policy is to be open and inclusive. So if anybody has any ideas for a project and can benefit from being sort of within the umbrella of YIISA, and people are very welcome. And the second thing I want to mention, and I'll send emails to the people who presented, I hope that we can create an edited volume of the papers that were presented here. And I think we have good relations with the Yale University Press, and to perhaps create an edited volume. So I'll be in contact with the scholars, and I hope you'll participate in that, because I think the papers are really good and thought-provoking. Awesome.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to that last idea, which is that I think that the educational programs which are geared towards children living in the United States are useful, and I see a very clear function for them. And I've seen kids who've encountered anti-Semitism and they need to know how to deal with it. But I think also I've seen that we have mandated Holocaust education and that I see students who've gone through it and don't even know they've been through it. And those programs have all sorts of issues. One thing is that they don't usually get to the people who need it the most. They're not given in the right countries, they're not given, the right people don't pay attention to them. And even when they're done, they're often done by people who aren't that well trained in what they're doing, they teach the wrong lessons. So I don't have really high hopes for stopping the tide of global anti-Semitism through programs that address towards children, young, middle, or older in the U.S. I'd like to see college students and other people become active in getting at the real problem, which is the socialization for intense hatred, which is taking place in many Middle Eastern countries. And we don't have any access to that. There's nothing.
They are very involved in the counter-education.
Yeah.
I mean, they do terrific. We should learn from them.
Yes, that's
I
right.
mean, we call it propaganda.
Yes.
They serve their purpose very persistently and very effectively. I think that maybe this is something to have a better understanding how what we view as a propaganda with a negative connotation is as effective in the very systematic. It's not just some kind of massive violent brainwashing. It is a very organized way to teach their children to hate Jews. And we need to find a way to educate everybody, not only Jews, how to counter those kind of forces, because they are successful, we are not.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
I really follow what Dan said. I think that this could be a contribution not only to anti-Semitism but to psychology in general, because I looked at programs for prejudice and like we have, we talk about education and then I really like all this stuff, but the world, I mean, it changed and it's globalization, we no longer, and we have the internet and the impact of propaganda is tremendous, and we basically in psychology we don't have much tools for intervention using the media. And so I think that this kind of project, it's a real challenge, and we have the notion of non-conscious goals, it's like experimental notion, but this could be translated to intervention, and I really believe that it's efficient, and it's not done. I mean, the Muslims, they do it fantastically, and we have a lot to learn. And we think that by reasoning, education, but it's not work. It doesn't work like that. It's like automaticity, and we need to understand that and just to use the same strategy. And because education is very slow, and we need to do something more immediate and more,
It was like Israel Jews had a positive reputation, I guess, after the 6-Day War, and then maybe since then it's just kind of been people that have kind of just let it